Select clause. In this video I will show you, what does it mean and how to use to write a LINQ query. Let's get started. Select is used to define the results to return from a query. The clause can be used in this way. Select and an expression. The expression will be, for example, the variable you want to select, or different variables, or a calculation, etc. But the select clause is not required for a query. What does that mean? How can I select the output elements from a query without using select? To understand this point, you first have to understand the options we have, once we want to get an output from a LINQ query. The output of a LINQ query could be one of three different options. The first one is, that we have a specific data type as input, and we want to get the output in the same data type, without modifying the elements. This means, I am only filtering the data, without doing any modifications. For example, the following query, and the following table. Here I am filtering a data table to get only the rows, where the first name is equal to John. As you see, I use the select clause with the range variable, row, what I defined in from clause. This means, I want to get the rows from the input table, but after filtering them. I didn't modify the rows or change anything. I only filtered the rows and selected the matched rows. The output here will be also a data table. So, the input and the output have the same data type. Both are data tables. Let's check how does this query work exactly. I have these three clauses, from, where, select. In from clause I have the input table, which contains 6 rows. In where clause I filtered the table and got only the matched rows. So, here I only have 3 rows. In select clause I selected these 3 rows. If I don't have select clause in this query, I will also get the 3 rows as output. So, in this case, I don't really need to use select clause. Why that? Because I only have one variable in the query, which is row, the range variable. And I didn't modify anything. I also want to select the rows, what I am filtering. And the result of filtering is already there, therefore using select clause or not, will not change anything on the output of the query. Let's check another query, for example this one, where I am filtering an integer array. Here I have let clause, where I defined a new variable, power. Let clause computes a value and assigns it to a new variable within the query. I will explain this clause in the next video. For now you only have to understand, that this clause is like an assign activity in UiPath, where you define a variable and assign a value. Power variable has the value of multiplying the number by itself. In other words, I am calculating the power of each number, which meet the condition in where clause. In select clause I use the number variable, what I defined in from clause. The output of this query will be the following integer array, which contains the number, that meet the condition in where clause. If I am using this variable, power, instead of number variable, I will get the following array, which contains the numbers, that meet the condition, but also after calculating the power of each number. So, in this query I defined 2 variables. Each variable will return another result. In this case, I have to use select clause, to define what I want to select from the query, because there is more than one variable in the query. Let's visualize the query to understand it better. I have the following 4 clauses, from, where, let, select. From returns the array, which contains 5 numbers. Where clause returns only 2 numbers, which meet the condition. Let clause returns the following 2 numbers, where I calculated the power of each number in where clause. Select clause returns either the content of where, or let, depending on the variable I used in this clause. So, I have to define what I want to select, else I will get a compiler error. This means, select clause in this case is mandatory, because we have different variables in the query, and it's not clear, what should be selected. This was the second option of getting an output from a LINQ query. Here I also have the same data type for input and output, but inside the query I modified the data, and I had 2 different variables, therefore I have to use select clause. Let's check the last option. This option is when I want to get another data type for the output, as what I have in the input. For example, the following data table, which contains 3 columns. I have the following query, where I am filtering the table, to get only the rows, where the first name is John. After that I am selecting only the content of column first name. This means, I am only selecting strings from a column of the table. The output here will be a collection of strings, which contains the names from the column first name, that meet the condition. So, here I have a data table as input, and a collection of strings as output. In this case I must use select clause, to define what I want to get from the query. Without using the clause, I am not able to execute the query. Or in other words, without using select clause, I will get a data table as output, which contains the rows that meet the condition. These were the three options we have, once we want to get an output from a LINQ query. Let's summarize these three options. The first one is, where the input and the output have the same data type. And inside the query there is only one variable. Here I can use select clause, but I don't have to do that. So, select clause is optional in this type of queries. The second one, where the input and the output have the same data type. But inside the query I modified the elements and want to get something specific. In other words, I have more than one variable inside the query. Here I have to use select clause, to define which variable I want to get as output. The third one, where the input and the output have different data types. For example, input is a data table and output is an array. Here I also have to use select clause, so that I can convert the data to the specific data type, what I want to get as result. That's all about the first point, when to use select clause. The next important point you have to know, is the type of the query output. In from clause video, I mentioned, that the data source we are using in the query, will be converted to 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗃. For example, if the data source I want to query is an integer array, this will be interpreted or converted to 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗃. Rows of a data table will be converted to 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗃 row. Columns of data table will be 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗃 column. Array of string will be 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗃string. And so on, each data source will have a new data type. This means, everything we are doing inside the LINQ query, is based on the new type in from clause. This also means, that select clause will select the same data type, what we have in from clause. For example, this query is to loop an integer array and to filter the numbers. As mentioned, array of integer will be converted to 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗃, in from clause. This means, once we execute select clause, we are selecting this new data type, 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗃. So, the output of this query will not be an integer array, as what we had as data source, but it will be of type 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗃. This is very important to know, because normally once we write a LINQ query, we need sometimes to get the data in a specific data type, for example as an array, not as 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗃. In summary, each LINQ query returns an output of type 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗃. In some cases, it returns an output of type 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗃. It depends on the query we are writing, and also on the functions we use in the query. I will talk more about that later. If we want to convert the output to a specific data type, we have to use a specific function. For example, to convert the output to array, we have to use toArray function. To convert the output to list, we have to use toList function. To convert the output to data table, we have to use copyToDataTable function. And so on. We can use specific functions to convert the output of the query to a specific data type. I will explain all these functions later in the course in separate videos. So, for now you only have to learn two things. The first one is, that the output of a LINQ query is always of type 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗃, or of type 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗃. T is only a placeholder for the type. This means, T could be integer, data row, data column, string, boolean, etc. The second thing you have to learn is, that you can use specific functions to convert the output to a specific data type. The most used functions are these four functions, but there are also other functions to convert the output to a specific data type. That's all about the output of a LINQ query. One last thing you have to know about select clause is, that you can use it more than once in a query. It's like from and where clauses, which also can be used more than once in a LINQ query. This means, select can not only be used to select the output of a query, but also to select data inside the query, which should be modified using the query again. So, keep in mind that select is not only to select an output from the query, but also to select the data inside the query. In other words, select clause is to select data in general. I will show you some examples, how to use select clause for different data types, and also how to use more than one select clause inside a LINQ query. But before starting with examples, let's do a small recap for the first three clauses, what we learned until now. These are, from, where, select. From is used to define the data source, what we want to query. In this clause we define a range variable, which represents each element inside the data source. The type of the data source will be converted to 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗀𝗃. Where clause is to filter the data using a condition. Here we only have to write a condition that returns true or false. All elements that meet the condition will be included in the output of this clause. All elements that don't meet the condition will be excluded from the output. Select is to select the data we need. It can be used only to select the data as output, or it can be also used inside the query to select data that should be used later inside the query. This was a briefly recap for these three clauses, which are the main three clauses of a LINQ query. Or in other words, the most LINQ queries contain these three clauses, but it's not mandatory. As already mentioned, clauses can be used only in query syntax. I already explained query syntax, what does it mean and how it looks like. So, these clauses can be only used to write a LINQ query in query syntax. Now I will show you how to use these clauses to write a LINQ query in general. I will show you the standard structure of a LINQ query using query syntax, what I recommend you to use. This query structure is also what I will use the whole time, once I want to write a query in query syntax. First I will use bracket at the beginning, and bracket at the end. Inside the braces I will write the query. And after the braces I will use a conversion function, to convert the output of the query from 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗃, to a specific data type. For example, to array, to convert the output to array. Now I will start with the first clause, from. As mentioned, we use this clause in this way. Using this clause, I define the data source I want to query. Assume I want to filter the data source. In this case, I will use where clause. This can be used after from clause. For this clause we only need to set a condition. So, up to this point, I define the data source, and filter the data. After that I can select the data I want to return from the query. For that I will use select clause with a variable. In this query, I only have the range variable, what I defined in from clause, therefore I will use it here. But you can also use other variables here, if you defined other variables inside the query, or if you want to do something specific. You will see that later in the next videos, once you learn the next clauses. This is the standard query structure, what you can use to write any LINQ query using query syntax. As already mentioned, you can use all these clauses more than once inside the query. For example, if you want to use where clause more than once, you can use it directly after the first where clause, or also after select clause. If you have more clauses in the query, you can set the different clauses in the position you need. It depends on your requirement, what you want to do using the query. Let's now use this query structure to write some simple queries for different data types. I will start with a simple data type, array. For example, a string array. Here is the use case or the task, what I want to implement using a LINQ query. I have a string array, called myArray, which contains the following names. I want to filter this array, to get only the names, which start with the letter F. As output, I want to get an array, which contains only the names, that meet this condition. The query should be written in query syntax. Let's write this query step by step. First we have to read the data we need from this task. The data source is the string array, which contains the names. The condition is to get only the names, which start with letter F. The output should be also of type string array. And the last thing is the query structure, which is query syntax. So, now I have the information I need to write the query. Let's start writing the query. First I will use this query syntax structure. And now I will replace the different elements with the data I got from the task. The data source will be my array. As range variable I will define any variable name I want, for example name. The condition will be the following, to get only the names, which starts with letter F. In select clause I will use the range variable, name, what I defined before. As conversion function I will use toArray function, to convert the output to array. The query is ready now. As you see, it's very simple to write a query using query syntax. The output of this query will be the following string array, which contains only these two names, that start with letter F. As you see, this query contains only one variable, name. This means, I don't need to use select clause. The output will be also the same. Let's now add a new condition for this query using a second where clause. After filtering the names, I want to set a new filter, to get only the names, which contain the letter I. I can do that in many different ways. Let's check the first one. I will add new where clause after the first one, to write the second condition. The output of this query will be the following array, which contains only this name. Why I got only this name? I already have other names in the array, that contain the letter I. This happens because of the following. The first where clause returns only these two names, that start with letter F. The second where clause checks only these two names, and returns only this name, which contains the letter I. This means, at this point we don't check the data source array, but only the output of the previous clause. Therefore I got only this name, which meets both conditions. Starts with letter F, and contains letter I. I can also remove select clause from this query, and the output will be the same. I can also write the query as following. Here I used select clause between both where clauses. In this way, I selected the both names, which I got from the first where clause. After that I filtered these two names again, and selected the names, that meet the condition. The output here will be also the following array, which contains only this name. I can also write the same query, without using any select clause, because I only have one range variable in the query. The output will be also the same. I can also write both conditions in one where clause, like this query here. The output will be also an array, which contains only this name. I can also remove select clause, and the output will be also the same. As you see, I can do exact the same using the query, but I wrote the query using different clauses. I only have to make sure what I want to check first, and what is the result of each clause, so that I can write the query in a correct way, to get the correct result I am searching for. So, the order of the clauses is very important, where to write which clause. For example, the following query. Here I use the same conditions, but I have first the check for letter I, then the check for letter F. The first where clause returns the following names, which contain the letter I. The second where clause returns the following name, which starts with letter F. So, the result of this query is also the same, but the results of the clauses inside the query are different, because they are written in another order. This is how to write a LINQ query for an array. The same will be for lists, because lists and arrays are very similar, therefore I will not explain lists in this video. Let's now check another data type, for example DataTable. I have the following table, called 𝗵𝗽𝗋𝗀, which consists of 3 columns and 6 rows. I want to filter this table, to get only the rows, where the first name is equal to John. I want to get the result as DataTable, and the result should be stored in the same variable. The query should be written in query syntax. Let's write the query step by step. I will use the query syntax structure. First I will replace the data source with the table variable I have, then the following functions. As I already explained in from clause video, it's better to use the following statement, once we want to query the rows of a data table. I will set a range variable name, row for example. This statement acts like for each loop for the rows of the table. The data source is now of type 𝗵𝗽𝗋𝗀. Row variable represents each row inside the table, and it's of type data_row. Now I will write the following condition. As you see, I use the range variable, row, with the column name, first name. In this way I am checking the content of this column for each row in the table, if it's equal to John. In select clause I used also the range variable, to select each row, which meets the condition of where clause. After the query I used the conversion function, copy to DataTable, to convert the output to DataTable. This means, the output was of type 𝗵𝗽𝗋𝗀, and it will be converted again to DataTable using this function. So, the query is ready now. The result of this query will be the same DataTable variable, but it contains now only 3 rows, where the first name is John. I can also add more conditions using where clauses, or add more select clauses to this query, depending on my need. It's like the array examples, what I showed you before. You can add different where and select clauses for the query, to get specific data. I will not explain that again, because it's like arrays and it should be clear for you now. Let's now see how to write this query using assign activity in UiPath. On the left side, I will use the DataTable variable to store the result. On the right side, I will write the LINQ query. I can also write this query inside 𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗀𝗀 activity. The argument will be the following DataTable variable, which should be as input and output for the activity. The query will be as following. I only use the argument instead of the DataTable variable. The result will be exact the same, a data table consisting of only 3 rows, where the name is John. This is how to write the query using assign and 𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗀𝗀 activities. As you see, I use the same input and output variable for the query. I stored the output of the query in the same input variable. In other words, I only filtered the input table and saved it again. I could also create a new variable of type DataTable to store the output of the query. The query will be exact the same in this case. As a result, I will have 3 columns, as I have in the input table, and also 3 rows, where the name is John. So, there is no difference between both scenarios. Let's now check another scenario, where I have the same input table, my table. I want to write the same query, to get only the rows, where the first name is John. But now I want to store the output of this query in another DataTable variable, output table for example. This variable has already columns and rows, for example the following. As you see, I have more columns in this table. The column names are different in both tables. I want to store the content of column ID from the first table, in the column employee ID of the second table. The content of column first name from the first table, in the column name of the second table. The content of column last name from the first table, in the column surname of the second table. To store the output of the query in this table, I have to change the expression of select clause. Let's see how to do that. Here is the query, what I wrote before. I will change select clause to this one. Let's understand what I wrote here. First I use the output table variable, where I want to store the result. After that I use the property rows and the function add, to add new rows to this table. Inside the braces I have an expression, that consists of 4 expressions. I have 4 expressions, because I have 4 columns in the output table. Or in other words, I added 4 expressions, because I want to add values to 4 columns inside output table. Each expression is to add a value to a column. The first one is to add a value in the first column. The second one is to add a value in the second column. The third one for the third column, and the fourth one is for the fourth column. For example, the first expression is to get the value from column ID from the input table, my table. And because it at the first position, this value will be added in the first column of the output table. The second expression is to get the value from column first name from the input table. And because it's at the second position, it will be added to the second column of the output table. And so on. I am adding different values, from different columns, to the columns of the output table. I added an empty string here for the fourth column of the output table, but I don't need to do that. If I am adding a value here, it will be stored in the fourth column of the output table. But if I don't add any expression here, the fourth column will be empty. So, here we have to make sure, which value is used at which position, because the order is very important. So, the first value is always for the first column, the second value for the second column, and so on. This also means that the column names of the output table are not important. Using the query, I will get the same output as what I got from the previous query. This means the condition will filter the table and returns only 3 rows, where the name is John. This query returns 2 different outputs. To understand it better, let's try to write this query in an assign activity. I will show you 2 different scenarios. As mentioned, we write the query on the right side of this activity. On the left side we set the variable, where we want to store the output of the query. In the first scenario, I will use the variable my table. In this case I will get the following content for both tables. My table has now only these 3 rows, where the name is John. This happens because I am using this variable on the left side to store the output of the query. And the variable output table has 5 rows. The first 2 rows are the old rows, what I had before executing the query. The other 3 rows are the new rows, what I got from the query. This happens because of the expression in select clause. The expression was to add new rows to this table. So, no matter which variable I am using on the left side of assign activity, I added the filtered rows to this table using select expression. This was the first scenario. The second scenario is when I am using output table on the left side. In this case, I will get the following content for both tables. As you see, my table is not changed, because I didn't use it to store the result on the left side of the activity. But output table has now only these 3 rows, where the name is John. Why has that happened? As mentioned, the expression in select clause will add the filtered rows to output table. This means, the output table has 5 rows. But after executing the query, I am storing the result in the same variable, output table. And the result of the query contains only these 3 rows, therefore I am overwriting the old rows with these new rows. As a result, I will have only these 3 rows in the table. So, you have to make sure what you want to do using this query. If you want to add the rows to the existing table without overwriting the old rows, you have to use any DataTable variable except output table. If you want to overwrite the existing table, you have to use the existing table to store the result. This is how to use select clause to query data tables. That's everything you have to know about select clause for now. In the next videos, I will show you more examples, where I will use all these clauses, and other clauses. So, you will learn more about select clause later, how to use with other data types.